Hi, Gary Zacharias with the Apologist bookshelf. I don't know if you like science as much as I do, but ever since I was a kid, I especially enjoyed astronomy. But almost any science was good news. I liked reading about it. Well, there's one area of life, as far as Christians go, that create quite a stir, and it has to do with how did this world come about? How did this universe come about? So we've got young Earth creationism, people who believe the Earth has been here only a few thousand years and the entire universe only a few thousand years. And then, of course, you've got evolution that says there's no rhyme or reason, there's no God, there's no plan, everything's an accident, including you. But there's a third choice, isn't there? Well, actually, there are more choices than that. There's a framework theory and others, but there's also something called day age, or sometimes old Earth creationism. And I found that really fascinating because when I was a kid and going to church and having my teachers talk to me about it, it was just all assumed that it was a young Earth. I mean, they didn't even call it that. They just said this is what God did. And of course, my dad grew up with the Scofield Bible, and inside that Bible, it was edited by a man named Scofield. So inside that Bible, it had Genesis and had a little column down the middle that told you, key things about verses and all. One of the things it said there was 4004 BC. And I found that really interesting, 4004 BC. So what was Scofield doing? He was taking a man named Usher and taking his working out of the dates as he looked at Genesis and tried to figure out, when all these things happened. He came up with creation 4004 BC. That was in the Scofield Bible. That Bible sold a gazillion copies. That's what my dad grew up on. And that's what I heard my whole life. But since then, I've found out there are other ways to interpret Genesis and that are within the pale of Christianity. And one of them is the day-age model, or the old Earth. So I've been reading to kind of catch up and find out what that's all about. Of course, Hugh Ross is probably the best known of the old Earth people. He started an organization called Reasons to Believe, and reasons.org is his website. Well, this is somebody else, a man named Dr. David Snoke, Snoke. He has his PhD from the University of Illinois. He's an associate professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Pittsburgh. And so he's a physicist and a professor. So he argues about the scientific history of the world, but he doesn't believe the world was created recently. And so he has a book called Biblical Case for an Old Earth. That's the book that I got a hold of. I found it really interesting. A lot of people get pretty upset if you suggest there's something different as a possibility than the young Earth creation model. And they think somehow you've given up your Christian faith if you might believe something different. And I don't see that at all. I think there's room for Christians to disagree about this as long as we do it politely and as long as we have some reasons for what we believe in. So here's somebody who actually gives a thumbs up to this. Here's somebody who agrees with Snoke and actually gave a thumbs up to the book. It's Michael Behe. His name should sound familiar. He wrote Darwin's Black Box, and he's a big proponent of intelligent design. So here's what Behe says. As both a respected scientist and elder of the Presbyterian Church of America, David Snoke brings great breadth and erudition to the question of whether an old Earth is an orthodox interpretation of the teachings of the Bible. No matter what one's initial position, a biblical case for an old Earth will certainly provoke Christians to think more deeply about this often divisive topic. Yeah, exactly right. Here's somebody else that said something interesting. Jay Richards. I like his material. And here's what he had to say. It says this book has taken on a topic timeless and timely, reconciling our knowledge from Scripture and natural science. And he says there are many ways to go wrong in this endeavor. But he says Snoke does an excellent job with, he says, refreshing candor and aplomb. And he demonstrates his commitment to the integrity of both of God's books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. So he says every Christian who's ever struggled with the question of how to understand the Bible and modern science should read this book. And I think so too. I think it was really interesting. I want to take, instead of the old thing about, when did creation happen and things like that, he's been talking about Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. I wanted to switch on a different topic, and that's the flood of Noah. And why that one? Because young Earth creationists will say, when they look out at geology and some of the strata of the rocks and things, they always come back to, well, that was flood geology. In other words, it's the flood of Noah. And so that's often used as kind of the catch-all for everything that's going on. So he wanted to take a look at the study of Genesis 1 and to say, is it necessary? Must I interpret that story of Noah as a global 6-mile deep flood that covered even Mount Everest? Or, he says, is it possible to interpret the story as more of a local flood? And I like what Snoke says. He said, okay, he said, I know. He said, I can hear people saying, here we go, down the slippery slope. He's going to explain away creation. Now he's going to explain away the flood. Is he going to explain away all the miracles of the Bible? And he says, absolutely not. And so he starts in, he said, let's take a look. He said, if there's a miracle, and in this case we're talking about the miracle of the flood, we should expect there to be some tracks of it. So he says, archaeology should be consistent with the records in the Bible of miraculous events. So he said, if the miracle was global, if that flood was global, we should expect global tracks. If it was really worldwide, we should see worldwide evidence. Now he said, of course, there are flood geologists, people who believe in the young Earth view, and they'll claim to have such evidence. He said, I think that's severely wanting. He said, they're just gaping holes in their arguments. So let's move ahead. He gets to what he calls the scientific case. That's the next start here to this chapter. And I like what he's doing. He says, let's start from the opposite side and assume that there really was a 6-mile deep flood that covered the entire globe. It has to be that deep if you're going to cover all the mountains, right? And he said, well, God certainly could have done this. Okay, but he said, look what this would have required. And he gives a list here. Let me see how many points he's got. Wow. 15 different points that he said would have to happen if you're going to have a 6-mile deep flood. So here we go. Number 1, you'd have to have the miracle of transporting millions of animals to the ark from places like Australia, the Americas, Antarctica, and the islands. He said there's some species of animals that only live in small niches in ecology. They couldn't have made it to the Middle East without a miracle, God intervening. Is it possible? Yeah. But let's keep going. That's just miracle number 1. Here's miracle number 2. You'd have to compress somehow all these animals into the ark. He said the volume of the ark is not large enough for all the animal species. And then imagine the food and the fresh water, because they're at sea for about a half a year. Here's miracle 3, the miracle of the feeding of the carnivorous animals. So you've got to somehow take care of them. Number 4, how do you take care of millions of animals by just 8 people? Okay, that's another miracle. Number 5, how about miracle of the survival of the occupants? But why? Because you got this huge heat production going on in a closed space. Number 6, you got a miracle of the special climate animals like polar bears and penguins, and they're going to make it on the ark for 6 months. Number 7, miracle of the feeding of special diet animals, the koala. Right? They don't eat just anything. Number 8, the miracle of the creation of water out of nowhere. And then you've got to destroy that water afterwards. So he said, if you have a normal flood, the water moves from one place to another. But for a global flood, you've got to have new water. And he said, of course, you got people that say that the water was somewhere residing down deep in special holding tanks called springs of the great deep. And then they went back there. But he said, where are these holding tanks now? Where is there enough water to cover up the earth up to a 6-mile depth? He said, well, then you got other people say, no, it was probably something called a cloud canopy that had the water. But he said, if you've got enough water to cover the earth to a 6-mile depth, that canopy would have to be so thick, the surface of the earth would have been hotter than Venus and so dark, the moon and the sun wouldn't have been visible. And that's a contradiction to Genesis 1. So that was miracle 8. Here's miracle 9. The miracle of the preservation of the land under the weight of all that water, tremendous pressure. Number 10, the miracle of the survival of trees and plants that are underwater. He said plants normally suffocate after just a short time underwater. But he said, look in Genesis 8, a dove comes back with a fresh olive leaf shortly after the waters subside. Number 11, You got to have a miracle of the survival of freshwater fish and saltwater, or saltwater fish and freshwater. How do you keep the waters from mixing? Number 12, the miracle of the survival of amphibious and tidal pool creatures on the ark. He said certain species have to have particular conditions of water environment. So Noah would have to set up special aquariums that would change the kind of water at different times of the day. 13, the miracles of the survival of worms and insects underwater. Termites, ant colonies. He points out, he says, if you had every kind of worm and bug had to come on the ark, he said, that would have been very exciting indeed. Yeah, no kidding. Number 14, miracle of the sorting of fossils underwater into layers. He said, and that's something that he covered in an earlier chapter, he said, this sorting is not by weight, but by land versus sea attributes. And then finally, number 15, the miracle of the upright trees underwater. Okay, so we're talking on upright trees. So he said, God could have done it. Absolutely, he believes God could have done it. But he said, there's no indication in the Bible text of any of that. You have to read in to the text all of those miracles. So he says, some advocates of a global flood have argued that all those miracles weren't necessary. Why? Because the earth was relatively flat and the continents were not divided before the flood. And there weren't that many animal species, which then mutated after the flood. Well, Hugh Ross has pointed this out, that really is like super evolution. That's like evolution on steroids, because he said, what do you have going on right after the flood? Mountains spring up in a matter of weeks, continents tear apart and skid across the ocean at high speed. Radiation pours from the skies. It creates mutations. You get new species of plants and animals, all within a few hundred years between Noah and Abraham. So that's pretty amazing. And again, he says, of course God could do it, but where is the evidence? There's no evidence. He said, mainly, why do people buy into this? Why do they say, well, look, that's what the text says. Well, let's go back. He said, let's take a look at Genesis 7. It says the water covered all the mountains. Oh, there you go. That includes Mount Everest and every other mountain range on earth. But he said, wait a minute, slow down. He said the literal reading is the water rose 20 feet and all the high hills were covered. He said the NIV gives a similar translation. It says, the passage says the water rose 20 feet, not 6 miles. Okay, so that's interesting. It's different, isn't it, than you'd think. It says, then take a look at what else is going on there. It uses the word earth, but he said that's more directly translated land. So it kind of biases the reader, doesn't it? If you say, and it covered the earth, or it covered the world. That sounds like the globe or the planet. But he said that's not in the original text. He said, did everyone on the entire globe come to Egypt? That's what it says in Genesis 41. All the land came to Egypt. He says, so the most natural meaning in Moses' day of the water covered all the land is the water covered everything as far as the eye could see, and not Mount Everest, for example. And so he changes the reading of this based on what's actually the best translation. I don't know if I'm going to take the time to do that. It's too long here. But he says he's going to bring the flood to come. And so I think I'll skip that. Okay, so he says you could read it and I'll just let you read it, right? So I'm not going to read that. Genesis 6 and Genesis 7. But you've got the land, right? The land, not the earth, flooded. So he said you can read this as a relatively local flood that has the purpose of killing all humans, not some rabbit, he says, on the top of the Alps. And he says the size of the boat would have been just about right for animals in the Middle East. He says, well, one of the objections people have to a local flood is they assume that means maybe people escaped the flood because they were living elsewhere. But he said that doesn't follow. Scripture says the flood killed all people. Now some wonder, well, how would a localized flood accomplish this? But it says, if you look after the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, it said people, even after Noah, would refuse the command of God to fill the earth, and they would just remain clumped together in the Middle East until God dispersed them. So he said that's probably what went on in the time before Noah. So if you had a flood restricted to the Middle East, that's where the people were. It would kill every person. Now he said if all people descended from Noah, that oral tradition of a great flood, and that's in so many tribes around the world, would go with them as they spread to fill the earth after Babel. He said if you go to the New Testament, it doesn't specify the size of the flood. So that's interesting too. He said the only statements in the story of Noah that might give people difficulty for that local flood view are God's promises. Here's what God says. Never again will I curse the ground because of man. That's Genesis 8. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the land. That's 9. So Snoke says, well, if this is a local flood, then did God mean there will never be any more local floods or other natural disasters? No, that clearly not. We have those at the same time. He said, what's being said here by God? Go to the next verse, Genesis 8:22. While the land remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So God is saying, I will not do what I have done, but instead there will be a balance in nature. So God is saying his promise there in Genesis 8 is the balance of nature won't be overturned again. All right. He says the flood, it becomes kind of an archetype for God's judgment. So he said in chapter 5, the creation story of Genesis has elements in it that would have indicated to the reader in those days that God controlled powerful forces, like the sea and the darkness and Leviathan and things like that. So he said we do have a story. The flood story is like the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, of God's powerful wrath and destruction. So anyway, he said he's finishing up that chapter there. And you know what I like at the end of the chapter? He's got questions to think about. So here's the first question. Is it legitimate to change the meaning of Genesis 7:20 from the water rose 20 feet and covered the high hills to the water rose 20 feet above the highest mountains? See, that's crucial, isn't it? Question number two. If the word land were used in English translations of Genesis 7-9 instead of the word earth, as it legitimately was in the original text, would that affect the way you read the passage? Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm saying yes. I don't know if you do, but if somebody says to me, the land, I'm just kind of thinking local. But if they say earth, I'm thinking a globe. And then question number 3, if the world was utterly recreated after the flood with thousands of new species, mountains, and breaking apart of the continents, why doesn't the Bible say anything about this? I think that's an excellent question, too. So, one more time, this is a book that I think you might find interesting, A Biblical Case for an Old Earth. I didn't really tell you what some of the chapters were. I'm actually taking one of the last chapters. But he talks about the scientific case for an old Earth. He talks about death, because young earthers are going to say, well, death didn't enter the world until Adam sinned. And so you can't have animals dying. It had to be around the time of Adam. So he deals with that one. He talks about the Sabbath. He talks about how to interpret Genesis 1 and 2. And he talks about implications for theology. So, very good book. Very interesting book. Now, do you have to believe it? No. But I think he's made an excellent case, and so does Hugh Ross. I like a lot of his material as well. Again, we need to give grace to Christians that may disagree with us about the start of the universe and all. William Lane Craig has an interesting view. Not all Christians follow his ideas, but we like William Lane Craig, and we trust him on theology. But these are just areas that we're not really sure of. And so I think the number one thing is listening to other people, understanding what they say, and then investigating for ourselves and see what convinces us. I'll just tell you personally, I think there's enough evidence from the sciences to suggest the Earth and the universe have been here a long, long time. I think modern people, the human race, is recent. And so I think you can work it out and not have a problem with it for your own theology. Well, thank you for being part of this podcast, and I hope you're having a good day. Talk to you later.